Hello and welcome everyone. My name is Nora Gutzman. I work as a Senior Advisor at the Danish Institute for Human Rights, particularly in the area of business and human rights. And what we will speak about for around the next 10 minutes or so is the topic of whether to do an integrated or a standalone human rights impact assessment. So this question of whether human rights impacts of projects should be assessed via a dedicated or standalone assessment, or whether it's more practical to integrate human rights into, for example, an environmental, social and health impact assessment. But before we get started on this, just to give a little bit of context of why we are even talking about human rights and impact assessment. So in 2011, the United Nations Human Rights Council endorsed the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, which is now the leading international framework on business and human rights. Broadly speaking, it has three areas: the state duty to protect, the corporate responsibility to respect, and access to remedy. Under the corporate responsibility to respect pillar, there is an expectation that businesses exercise due diligence, and that is the process that we have outlined here. So businesses are expected to have a policy commitment to human rights, to assess their impacts, to integrate and act upon the findings of that impact assessment, to monitor and review their performance, and also, of course, to communicate and to report about due diligence and the findings from their impact assessments. As cross-cutting themes, we have stakeholder engagement and access to remedy, grievance mechanisms. Today, we will be focusing on the second step in this, which is the topic of assessing human rights impacts. So it's important to note that the UN Guiding Principles do not set an expectation that businesses conduct a standalone human rights impact assessment. There is a recognition that it might be more practical in certain situations to integrate human rights into other types of risk and impact assessment to make sure that businesses take a holistic approach. So what we know is that while there is an expectation to assess human rights impacts, there are multiple ways that are considered acceptable ways of doing this. But of course, some key questions remain for us. The first one being, in what types of situations is it more appropriate to use an integrated or a standalone assessment? And as a backdrop to that, we need to consider in a little more detail what are the pros and cons of integrated and standalone assessments. So first, considering integrated assessments. So this is when human rights are integrated, for example, into environmental, social and health impact assessments. Now, some of the potential strengths of using an integrated assessment are that it uses existing management systems within a company. It can also avoid duplication and stakeholder consultation fatigue. It can enable a more efficient use of resources, and it can also address human rights while using a language and processes with which projects and project teams are familiar. However, of course, there are also some potential cons of using an integrated assessment. For example, the process may not allow for very deep analysis of human rights impacts because these are integrated within an existing assessment. This means that in certain situations, human rights impacts can get lost if we're doing an integrated assessment. Related to that, potentially there is also an issue with ISHA practitioners' level of expertise in human rights, their ability to capture all the different things that we would like them to cover from a human rights perspective. And lastly, in certain contexts, it can also raise sensitivities or potential risks to rights holders if information in an integrated assessment that is sensitive from a human rights perspective is then published or included in a public domain report in an ISHA, particularly where that is submitted to a regulator who may be unsympathetic to human rights considerations. So these were some of the pros and cons that we can think about in terms of deciding whether to do an integrated or a standalone assessment. So now turning to the second option, which is a standalone, or what is sometimes referred to as a dedicated human rights impact assessment. So this is an assessment that focuses exclusively on human rights. So some of the potential strengths of an assessment such as this is that firstly, of course, it allows a very deep dive into human rights because this is the particular topic that you're focusing on. Related to that, we can also say that in a human rights assessment, there is particular emphasis on those communities and individuals who might be adversely impacted. This includes vulnerable groups and marginalized people in societies. So first of all, there is an emphasis on impacted rights holders, as well as the vulnerable groups within those different rights holder groups. A further strength of a standalone assessment is that it can be performed outside the regulatory requirements. So this means that irrespective of how the regulatory requirements are formulated, the company can undertake a human rights impact assessment and to take management actions then to address those impacts. This means that it can also be performed in areas where, for example, the government's human rights standards are not particularly high, or in contexts that we know are very problematic from a human rights perspective, or where the government is not sympathetic to human rights. However, of course, there are also some potential cons of undertaking a dedicated or a standalone human rights impact assessment. One of these relates actually to the skills of impact assessment practitioners. So what we see at the moment is that there are a lot of people that are skilled in human rights, but perhaps not very skilled in the nature of projects and impact assessment. And likewise, a lot of ISHA practitioners who are very familiar with projects and impact assessment processes do not necessarily have all the human rights skills that are necessary. So there is sometimes a mismatch in terms of the skills that we have available for people to actually undertake dedicated human rights impact assessments. Another potential con relates to costs. Now, we have to be a little bit careful here if we situate this as a con, because of course, if you integrate human rights into a different assessment, you also want to designate additional resources to make sure that they are adequately covered. So it's not just a case that you can have a more cost-effective system if you integrate human rights into assessments. However, if we look at, for example, joint venture agreements or negotiating with governments in terms of costs for impact assessments for a particular project, then sometimes it can be a harder sell to argue for another standalone impact assessment. The last 2 points to consider are that if you undertake a standalone human rights impact assessment, you may not so easily be able to fit that back into existing management systems that are in place within a company to then actually implement the mitigation measures and take up the recommendations that are made in that assessment. And the last consideration, perhaps, is that it also potentially can raise stakeholder expectations, particularly in difficult environments. So there are some considerations to be made in terms of how stakeholders are engaged, their expectations of what the impact assessment can deliver. So now that we've considered some of the pros and cons of integrated and standalone assessments, let's just wrap up with a few final considerations in terms of when would a standalone impact assessment on human rights perhaps be necessary? And broadly speaking, we can break these considerations down into 3 categories. The first one is around the ISHA process itself. So you might consider things such as, has the ISHA already been undertaken? Well, if that's the case and it hasn't considered human rights, then that is a compelling argument why to undertake a human rights impact assessment. Or perhaps the environmental and social impact assessment has alluded to particular issues concerning human rights that will need a deep dive assessment. Again, this might be an argument as to why you would need to undertake a human rights impact assessment. And lastly, as we've discussed a little bit already, where the ISHA sits in terms of the regulator's ability and willingness to consider human rights should be a consideration as to whether you do an integrated or a standalone assessment. The second set of considerations are more around the contextual factors. So in the particular project context, are there factors such as systemic gender discrimination, the presence of Indigenous peoples, particularly complex land tenure arrangements and structures? Is, for example, large-scale resettlement foreseen? Or are we operating in a conflict-affected area? This is just a selection. It's not a conclusive or exclusive list, but just to give you some ideas of the sorts of contextual factors that might give rise for us to consider that a dedicated human rights impact assessment is desirable in this context. And the third consideration is really more around capacity building and the focus on human rights that is desired through the impact assessment. So if there is a particular objective in terms of capacity building, both within the company but also externally, so particularly with rights holders, but also other external stakeholders such as government, joint venture partners, etc. If building capacity on human rights is a particular objective, then that, of course, is a third consideration as to why you might want to undertake a dedicated human rights impact assessment.